Welcome to my channel. I want to introduce Casey Luskin of the Discovery Institute. I've been listening to him for years and years on ID the Future podcast. I think you're a senior fellow at the... I don't know what you are. Let's introduce yourself, what you do at the Discovery Institute, and then we'll talk about why you're here today.
That's fine, Jeff. Thanks a lot. I know that we've corresponded for many years over issues related to ID, and it's really nice to be able to go on your channel today. My name is Casey Luskin, and I'm Associate Director of the Center for Science and Culture at Discovery Institute. Discovery Institute is most well known for its work on intelligent design. That would be the Center for Science and Culture. That's our ID program, but we actually do a lot outside of intelligent design. We also have projects that work in technology and communications and foreign affairs and transportation and education and also artificial intelligence with the Bradley Center now. So there's a lot going on at Discovery. We're not just about ID, but certainly I think we're most well known, infamously known for our work in intelligent design. So I guess, Jeff, should I just share my screen here and we can get started?
Yeah, introduce the topic, and we're going to be talking about, I guess, molecular evidence as it relates to phylogenetic trees. And I've been first time I heard about this was maybe over a decade ago, and I've been really interested in the topic. So I decided to get you on to talk about it, and maybe just kind of do your presentation and kind of explain, I think. Is that me and you're sharing?
Okay, I should be doing this here. There we go.
Yeah,
okay.
There you go.
All right.
As much as I like looking at myself, there's only so much that my audience can take of me. So I'll let you go get into everything, and I'm going to mute myself, and then we'll do a question and answer when you're done.
Sounds good. Sounds good. I'm going to put this on my primary monitor here, and we should get started. Okay, can you see my slides?
I can see your slides.
Okay, great. All right, well, yeah, thanks a lot, Jeff. This little talk is actually a section from a larger talk that I give on the overall evidence for common ancestry in a variety of different fields. But this particular section is looking at the evidence for common ancestry within DNA and anatomical similarities, what we often call homology, and really looking at the question of how do we generate and build phylogenetic trees. And are phylogenetic trees evidence for evolutionary theory, for common ancestry, for Darwinian evolution, whatever you want to call it? How strong is that evidence for phylogenetic trees from DNA and anatomical similarities? And so, again, this is part of a larger talk. People will often say that the evidence for common ancestry is built upon a cumulative case from multiple independent lines of evidence that converge upon a single answer, which is, of course, common ancestry. Those multiple lines of evidence are often biogeography, paleontology, or fossils. Then we have DNA and anatomical similarities, and then also embryology. And of course, there are other lines of evidence as well that are often brought in here, but I think that the most popular line of evidence that people read about in textbooks and study in school would be DNA and anatomical similarities, or homology, as evidence for common ancestry. So what do we mean by homology? Well, homology means similarity of structure or position, but not necessarily similarity in function. So you can have two features in biology that have similarities because of maybe where they exist, what their structure is, what their DNA sequence underlying them is, but they might have different functions, and we call them homologous. So, for example, this is a very common example of homologous limbs. Human beings have a limb that is used for grasping, or if you're an ape, you would use your arms for climbing. If you're a quadruped, you're going to use these limbs for your arms for walking. But if you're a whale, you're going to use your front limbs for swimming as a flipper. And if you're a bat, you're going to use your front limbs for flapping, for flying. And so these front limbs in these different types of mammals have similar structures and positions, but they have different functions. We call them homologous. And within neo-Darwinian theory, homology is usually taken as evidence for common ancestry. We say that this is similarity that is due to common ancestry. But the question that immediately comes up is, are there other explanations for these similarities, these structural and positional and even functional similarities between species other than common ancestry? And so we can often reduce this question to, are we looking at common descent or are we looking at common design? And what is the right answer here? Are these different structures that were designed for a similar purpose, and that's why they're similar in different organisms, or is this the result of common descent, inheritance from a common ancestry? Is that why we have these similarities across different organisms? So what is common design? Common design is, of course, reusing different functional components, similar functional components in different designs. And so a classic example would be reusing wheels on cars or airplanes, or reusing keyboards on cell phones or tablets or other devices where you have these similar features that are reused in different designs for similar purposes. And this is a good potential explanation for why we see similarities in different organisms. And in fact, two ID theorists, Paul Nelson and Jonathan Wells, I think, Jeff, you're going to have Paul Nelson on in the near future to talk about this issue as well. And we have a lot of agreements in our approaches to these issues. But he's written that an intelligent cause may reuse or redeploy the same module in different systems and generate identical patterns independently. So what he's saying is that intelligent agents will often reuse or redeploy similar components, similar modules in different systems for the purpose of performing a similar function. And so you can generate identical patterns or similar patterns independently without there necessarily being some kind of a genetic ancestry between those two systems. And so this is a good, I think, theoretical basis for why we can assume that if intelligent design is true, we might find common design throughout biology. In fact, when we look at human technology, we see common design very frequently used. Of course, if you're a Windows user, or if you're a computer programmer, you're very familiar with this principle of common design. I did a lot of Python programming during my PhD, Jeff, and I would often, make a program, and then I'd have to make a similar program, and I would start with that initial program I wrote as the kernel with which I would build the new program. And Microsoft does the same thing. We have Windows 95, 98, 2000, Millennium Edition. This is obviously an old slide. There's Windows, then we had XP, and then Windows Vista. Remember that? Oh, what a disaster Vista was. And then we had Windows 7, and then of course Windows 10, et cetera, et cetera. But all these versions of Windows share similar programming modules that are used across these different versions of Windows. Because what programmers will do is they will reuse programming modules that work in different programs to perform similar functions. And that's exactly what we see going on in human technology. So it's a good design principle to reuse different parts or components in different designs. Human designers do this all the time. So one of the answers then that we could give from a design viewpoint is that perhaps vertebrates were built upon a common body plan because that bone structure is highly efficient for moving and manipulating a limb with an internal bony skeleton and appendages. So the fact that we see these similar bone structures in vertebrate limbs, similar positions and structures, maybe that is because it is an efficient design for allowing an organism, a mammal, to have these limbs, to be able to manipulate those limbs to do things and move around at whatever they need to do. So we could see common design at work in the design of vertebrate limbs. So perhaps one of the most common arguments for homology doesn't come from the physical structures of an organism or its morphology, but from its DNA. In fact, I think that one of the most common arguments you'll see in textbooks for common ancestry is the universality of the genetic code, where all organisms are said to use the same 3 nucleotide codons to signify various amino acids or other commands during protein translation. And on the right side of the screen, of course, we have the famous genetic code where you have 3 nucleotides that specify each of the amino acids. These codons are said to be used universally throughout life. And that universality of genetic code shows a homology, which is supposed to point to all of us deriving from a universal common ancestor from which we all inherited this common genetic code. So is this a good argument that the genetic code is universal across all organisms? Well, turns out the genetic code is not universal across all organisms. In fact, there are, at least at the time that I captured this screenshot, there were 33 different variants of the genetic code. I think this is already outdated. I just remember hearing about a new genetic code that was discovered recently. And so there's lots of different versions of the genetic code that are out there in biology. Now, I should qualify this and say that there is something called the standard genetic code, and that is found in the vast majority of organisms, but it's not universal. It's not true that every single living organism on Earth uses the same genetic code. In fact, there are a lot of variations among the genetic code. And so, we can ask the question, well, if the universality of the genetic code is supposed to point towards common ancestry, does the non-universality of the genetic code point against common ancestry? I don't know if I can answer that question because I'm not the one making the argument. The evolutionary camp is the one making this argument. They can tell you if the lack of universality of the genetic code is a problem for common ancestry. I think it is, because I think it's hard to explain how you're going to evolve new codes. It's kind of like if you were to rewire your keyboard and then you're typing the same keys, but you're getting the wrong letters being typed. That's sort of like what would happen if you were to change that genetic code. You would have a lot of, or potential quite a bit of gibberish being created or being read when you're trying to translate proteins, and it would cause a lot of problems from the organism. So maybe you can do this, maybe you can't. Whatever the answer is, the argument then shifts to, well, it's not necessarily genetic code, but we see that across life, there is a identical usage of what we might call fundamental biological polymers and nucleic acid, genetic material, amino acids, and core metabolism. So we see virtually the same basic biomolecules being used across organisms. Maybe the genetic code has some variants, but at least the same amino acids, the same nucleic acids, the same basic polymers and building blocks of life are being used across different organisms. So again, however, I would say that common design can explain these similarities because, of course, there could be functional reasons for reusing the same building blocks if they work well for building an organism. And in fact, there could be other reasons for using the same building blocks. One of the reasons that it's good for us to eat other living organisms, whether we're talking about plants or animals, is that we can get nutrients from them. And the reason we can get nutrients from them is because they use the same amino acids we do. They use the same they use nitrogen just like we do. So if we need nitrogen, we can eat a plant or eat an animal, and we can get the nitrogen that's in that organism. We can just get the amino acids from that organism. Or we can get other biomolecules that we need by using nutrients we eat from other organisms. But I would say that at the very least, there's a plausible argument that different organisms use these same basic biomolecules because it's a good design principle. These are molecules that work well as building blocks for carbon-based life forms. So I think common design can explain these similarities. But it turns out, actually, that not all fundamental biomolecules are universal. So, for example, if you consider the basic enzymes and proteins that are used in DNA replication, they're highly different between prokaryotes and eukaryotes. And there's a lot of differences across the broad spectrum of living organisms when you look at their fundamental biomolecules. In fact, one paper compared the genomes of 1,000 different prokaryotic organisms and found that of the 1,000 genomes available, not a single protein is conserved across all genomes. So there's a lot of variation even at the fundamental level of biomolecules. So then the argument becomes, well, look, of course there's differences, different molecules that are used in different organisms. But what we can do is we can organize the similarities and differences across different species into a nested hierarchy or a phylogenetic tree. And this phylogenetic tree is exactly what is predicted from Darwin's theory of evolution by descent with modification through natural selection acting upon organisms, and they evolve as they reproduce through the generations. Okay, and so what the prediction becomes is we can generate these phylogenetic trees, and that is evidence of common ancestry. So what is a phylogenetic tree? A phylogenetic tree, also known as a phylogeny, is a diagram that purports to show the ancestral relationships between a group of organisms. And they're supposed to show that you can nest organisms or nest genes, and so forth within a nested hierarchy where there's a branching pattern that shows the order of evolution of these various species or organisms within a tree. And so there are multiple problems that we need to understand when we see these phylogenetic trees. We've seen them all in textbooks. This diagram right here is actually the only illustration from Darwin's Origin of Species. And we see these phylogenetic trees in textbooks, in coffee table books. If you still buy those sorts of things, I think you can still find them at Goodwill if you want one of those. We see them in TV documentaries or YouTube shows talking about the evidence for evolution. So are these phylogenetic trees really solid evidence, or are they more interpretation of evidence that is sort of based upon assumptions? I would say that there are multiple problems with phylogenetic trees that are often not disclosed. People will show these phylogenetic trees in a presentation and say, look, these show how these groups of organisms are related, as if they're just unequivocal fact. But the reality is phylogenetic trees are based entirely upon assumptions. And the main assumption of building phylogenetic trees is that biological similarity indicates or is the result of common ancestry. Okay, so anytime you see similarity between two organisms, evolutionary systematists who build these phylogenetic trees assume, at least at first, that that similarity is the result of common ancestry and inheritance from a common ancestor. Okay, so when you see these phylogenetic trees, I don't want you to see hard facts. I want you to see interpretation of facts using assumptions. It's kind of like a house of cards. Phylogenetic trees are literally nothing more than assumptions. Now, maybe those assumptions are true. I'm not, it's not necessarily wrong to make assumptions. In science, we make assumptions all the time. Whether those assumptions hold or not is a separate question. It's okay to have starting assumptions, to build models and test those models. I don't have a problem with the fact that they do this. But I'm calling it a problem. I'm calling it a problem because we need to understand that phylogenetic trees are based upon assumptions, and that the fact that these are assumptions is almost never disclosed. That's really what the problem is here. And so I think that you need to realize when you see a phylogenetic tree, see assumptions rather than necessarily evidence. Look for the evidence that is being interpreted through those assumptions. Don't necessarily think that those trees themselves are evidence. So the first assumption, again, is that biological similarity indicates common ancestry. And this is rarely disclosed here, but there was an article in Biological Theory years ago that acknowledged this assumption. It said molecular systematics is largely based upon the assumption that the degree of overall similarity reflects degree of relatedness. Review of the history of molecular systematics and its claims in the context of molecular biology reveals that there is no basis for this molecular assumption. So they're kind of challenging that assumption. And we do sometimes see this assumption stated. If you get into like the textbooks of systematics, here's a phylogenetics website on the UC Berkeley Understanding Evolution website talking about cladistics, which is a method of constructing these trees. And they acknowledge here, actually quite candidly and quite uncommonly, that there are three basic assumptions in cladistics. And the first assumption right here, any group of organisms are related by descent from a common ancestor. So don't miss what you're seeing here. The assumption in cladistics, in building these phylogenetic trees, is that any group of organisms you find, anywhere you look, they are related by descent from a common ancestor. That is an assumption. It is not a conclusion from the data. It is a starting assumption, which they start with when they approach the data. So that's a really important point to appreciate, that this is an assumption. It's not a conclusion. It is a starting point that they start with. No matter what the evidence is, no matter what organisms they find, they assume that they are related by descent from a common ancestor. I think this is very important to appreciate. So phylogenetic trees assume common ancestry. This is an assumption, not a conclusion. So again, why do we see these phylogenetic trees all over the place? Well, it's because when people take organisms and they score the characters, they say, well, does this organism have eyes? Does this organism have limbs? Does this organism have flapping flippers? Does this organism have a head? They will score the traits that an organism has with either a 0 or a 1. They can then feed that data into a computer program, and out pops a phylogenetic tree. Why did they get a phylogenetic tree? Because a programmer created a computer program to analyze data and produce phylogenetic trees. It's really simple. So this was a nice acknowledgement by Michael Savanen in Annual Review of Genetics. He says, because tree analysis tools are so widely used, they tend to introduce bias into the interpretation of results. Hence, one needs to continually be reminded that submitting multiple sequences, DNA, protein, or other character states to phylogenetic analysis produces trees, because that is the nature of the algorithm used, okay? So phylogenetic trees are constructed by computer programs that were written by programmers assuming that similarity equals some evolutionary ancestral relationship, okay? And then they build those assumptions into their algorithms, and they use those algorithms to produce to interpret data and produce phylogenetic trees, okay? So again, these are assumptions that go into the entire field of systematics and phylogenetics, and they're going to produce trees no matter what data set you give them, because that's what they do. They make trees. Even if the data set is not very tree-like, you're going to get a tree. So this brings us to the second problem with phylogenetic trees, is that, yes, we have assumptions here. That's not necessarily a big problem, except for when you fail to disclose it. And I had to hunt high and low for examples of evolutionary biologists disclosing these assumptions. Let me tell you, you're seeing the really good examples. It's hard to find examples of them disclosing these assumptions. But fine, we've disclosed the assumptions. That's better than most of the time. But the problem is that then these assumptions often fail because the data does not fit a tree-like pattern. And in my view, that should suggest, at least sort of ab initio, that common ancestry did not create that data set. So what are we talking about? Well, in the 1990s, when biologists started to sequence genomes of different organisms, we began to see new patterns that we didn't appreciate before. In fact, before this, we thought that life was resolved into kingdoms. But in the 1990s, they said, no, there's actually 3 basic domains of life: bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. And in this case called animals, plants, and fungi, but although the domain is called eukarya. And in this diagram, we see that when they tried to resolve the relationships between the 3 basic domains of life, that it did not form a tree, because the various traits found in these domains of life were not distributed in a tree-like pattern. In order to account for the distribution of traits among the basic domains of life, they had to construct something that was more like a web or a tangled thicket, because we saw that basically traits were not distributed among the basic domains of life in a tree-like pattern. And this really conflicted with the predictions of common ancestry. So what we see is that gene sequences and other traits appear in a pattern that cannot be explained by common descent. And there are many examples where biological similarities appear in places that cannot be explained by common descent. In other words, the main assumption of evolutionary tree building, that similarity equals common ancestry, is failing. Okay? Now, granted, in this case, in the case of the basic domains of life, evolutionary biologists have tried to retain common ancestry by invoking something called horizontal gene transfer. They will say that organisms, especially microorganisms, at the one-celled microorganisms, will not just pass on their genes to their offspring, but they can swap genes with their neighbors. So you can share genes not just vertically through descent, but also horizontally by passing genes around to other individuals that are alive at the same time you are. And they will use this to try to explain why we have this non-nested hierarchy, this failed prediction of common descent, this messy tree of life. Why do we find this? And they will invoke horizontal gene transfer. We're going to get to that more later, but for now, that's just sort of how they explain this. And you'll see how they have a lot of what we might call ad hoc epicycles that are used to explain away data that does not fit a tree-like pattern. They have these ad hoc explanations. We'll get into those. So right now, let's just focus on the idea of a tree, which was a very strong prediction from Darwin's theory. There was an article published in New Scientist back in 2009. It said that many biologists now argue that the tree concept is obsolete and needs to be discarded. this article said we have no evidence at all that the tree of life is a reality. So this is very interesting. Basically, as we've sequenced the genomes of more and more organisms, we're finding that their traits do not resolve into a nice, neat evolutionary tree or nested hierarchy. And this article quoted a scientist saying that the problem was that different genes told contradictory evolutionary stories. We've just annihilated the tree of life. It's not a tree anymore. It's a different topology entirely. So this is very, very interesting. This is really showing that as we've sequenced the genomes of different organisms, we find that one gene will give you one version of the tree of life, and another gene will give you an entirely different and conflicting version of the tree of life. And so we cannot reconcile these different trees. As Paul Nelson has said, to me, if there is, in fact, if common descent is in fact true, then there is one history of life, one true history of living organisms. And if that one, there's not multiple histories, there's one history. And we should be able to interpret the data and then decide what is that one history. The problem is that when we look at the data, it's not necessarily telling us a single story of what that history is. One gene will give you one version of the story. Another gene gives you a different version of the story. And some people will say, look, these phylogenetic incongruities only happen at the base of the tree of life. Whereas I said earlier, you can have horizontal gene transfer that can mess up the vertical transmission of genes only to offspring, okay? Well, the problem is that that's really not the case. We see these phylogenetic conflicts throughout the tree of life. And Carl Woese, who's often called the father of evolutionary systematics, he said, phylogenetic incongruities, which are conflicts, of course, can be seen everywhere in the universal tree, from its root to the major branchings within and among the various taxa to the makeup of the primary groupings themselves. So I think that this is a ubiquitous problem across the tree of life. There was an article that tried to resolve the relationships of the animal phyla, and it found that despite the amount of data and the breadth of taxa analyzed, relationships among most metazoan phyla remain unresolved. An article in Trends in Ecology of Evolution likewise said a major challenging for incorporating such large amounts of data into inference of species trees is that conflicting genealogical histories often exist in different genes throughout the genome. So we see different versions of the tree of life will exist, and you sequence one gene, you get one version of the tree of life, you sequence another gene, you get a different and conflicting version of the tree of life. And some people will say, well, look, as we get more and more data, these problems are going to get resolved. And we're going to be able to patch things up over time. But I think actually the opposite has happened. This is an article from Biological Reviews of the Cambridge Philosophical Society. It said, incongruence between phylogenies derived from morphological versus molecular analyses and between trees based on different subsets of molecular sequences has become pervasive as data sets have expanded rapidly in both characters and species. And the article went on to say that phylogenetic conflict is common and frequently the norm rather than the exception. So this kind of problem is very common when we're doing phylogenetic studies. There's also conflicts between DNA-based trees and trees based upon morphology or the bone structure or physical traits of living organisms. And an article in Nature titled Bones, Molecules, or Both said that evolutionary trees constructed by studying biological molecules often don't resemble those drawn up from morphology. Battles between molecules and morphology are being fought across the entire tree of life. And there's been some people who will say, look, we should use DNA or protein sequences, amino acid sequences and proteins to resolve the tree of life. And other people will say, no, we should be looking at the body structure of organisms, their morphology, in order to decide whether they're related. And these are big conflicts that have gone back and forth when you have these conflicting molecular versus morphological phylogenetic trees. So what do we do when we have data that doesn't fit a tree-like structure, or at least doesn't fit a preferred tree? And so I would say that there are three options that we're left with. So this is maybe, if you will, this is the third problem that phylogenetic trees face. And that is, what do we do when the data doesn't fit a tree? We can either A, ignore weird data. We can B, we can explain the data away. Or C, we can just reject common ancestry and say that common ancestry did not produce this data set. It's not a good explanation for the evidence that we're seeing. And we find that really what evolutionary biologists will do is they will appeal to either A or B. In very, very rare instances, you will see evolutionary scientists being willing to go with option C. But almost always what they will do is they will go with options A or B. And most commonly what they do, when they're not ignoring the data, is they will try to explain the data away through ad hoc explanations. And I've sometimes compared this to what was very famously done in the old 500 years ago, when people believed in the geocentric model of the solar system, the idea that the Earth was at the center of the solar system. Of course, we've known now for hundreds of years that the sun is at the center of the whole solar system, and Earth orbits the sun. But when they thought that the Earth was at the center, they were aware that there were these celestial bodies out there called planets, and they would watch them move across the sky, and it was thought that, they moved in a perfect sphere around the planets. But every once in a while, they would go backwards. And that's because these planets were not actually orbiting the Earth. They were orbiting the sun. And from our vantage, they would seem to change direction and go in the opposite direction. And this did not fit at all with the predictions of the geocentric model of the solar system. And so they would come up with these complex explanations for why these planets would do these weird dances in the sky and not do what they're supposed to do according to the geocentric model. Why would they go backwards? And they call these epicycles. And so an epicycle is sort of an ad hoc explanation that you come up with to explain why the data is not fitting with your theory. And this happens all the time in science. I mean, it's not necessarily wrong to look for ad hoc or auxiliary explanations to try to explain why the data is not fitting with the theory. But in the case of the geocentric model of the solar system, clearly the fundamental problem was not that the data was just quirky and we needed to invoke an epicycle. The fundamental problem with the geocentric model of the solar system is that it was wrong. And so sometimes you need to ask yourself, if your model is becoming so riddled with epicycles, then is it time to consider whether the model is wrong? And I would say that with common ancestry, at least in my view, we see so much ad hoc explanation to try to explain away data that does not fit phylogenetic trees that we really have to ask if the problem is with the theory itself. So one of the ad hoc epicycles that they use is convergent evolution. That's when two organisms evolve the same, are said to evolve the same trait independently without having inherited that trait from a common ancestor. So what happens is you get two organisms that share the same trait, but we know based upon our understanding of biology that there's no way that they inherited that same trait from a common ancestor that had that trait. So we say, they must have evolved that same trait independently. Let me give you some examples of phylogenetic reasoning to help explain what we mean by convergent evolution. So example one is we see that all humans have two eyes. Of course, we have on the left Mr. Bean, on the right we have Lady Gaga, very different human beings, but they both have two eyes. And I don't think that anybody has a problem believing that the fact that Mr. Bean and Lady Gaga both have two eyes is the result of inheritance from a common ancestor. It's hard to believe, but yes, they do share a common ancestor. Actually, it's not hard to believe because all living human beings, as far as we know, can interbreed to reproduce fertile offspring. And so that is really strong evidence that we're part of the same species and we share a common ancestor. Don't try to have a visual of Mr. Bean and Lady Gaga producing fertile offspring. We don't want to think about that, but if they wanted to, they could because they're both human beings, okay? And that is why it's very reasonable to say that the fact that they both have two eyes is the result of common ancestry. What about Mr. Bean and this dog? Well, Mr. Bean and this dog obviously cannot reproduce to produce fertile offspring, but can we say that perhaps the fact that they have, both have, I think I needed to take out an animation here. The fact that they both have two eyes, is that the result of common ancestry or common design? Well, I would say that we could go either way here, all right? Having two eyes is a good functional design for mammals who need to be able to see and navigate in the world that we live in. And so we could say that the fact that Mr. Bean and this dog have two eyes could be the result that they're built on a mammalian body plan, and there are functional reasons, and those functional reasons reflect their common design, or common design reflects those functional reasons, we might say, or maybe it is the result of inheritance from a common ancestry. So I would say in this case, Mr. Bean and the dog, maybe they do share these two similarities because of common ancestry, but I think common design could also explain this evidence. So we could go either way here. We could say common ancestry or common design. What about this example? Mr. Bean on the left and an octopus on the right. Well, it turns out that cephalopods, octopus, squid, I'm sorry here, guys. I think I needed to remove a couple of, can get rid of these animations for the moment. Mr. Bean, cephalopods, like squid, octopus, and cuttlefish, have 2 eyes. And it turns out that we do not think that the common ancestor of human beings, vertebrates, and mollusks had 2 eyes. In fact, we don't even know if it had eyes at all or what kind of eyes it might have had. There's no reason to think that our common ancestor, supposedly, between mollusks and vertebrates had 2 eyes. So we would say that the fact that an octopus has 2 eyes and a human being has 2 eyes is the result of convergent evolution. We just happen to stumble upon the same design independently. All right, so this is sort of not a good example where shared similarity. Whoops, sorry guys, having some problems here. In this case, shared similarity is not the result of common ancestry. Even though the human and octopus eyes have a very similar eye, we would call this convergent evolution. But what about common design? I'm going to just go into my slides here because something got a little bit tweaked. I want to show you something, and that is that humans and octopus don't just have similarities in their eyes because we have 2 eyes. We actually have a very, very similar fundamental design to the eye. It's a camera type eye. There are a few differences, including the wiring of the retina, but overall, the basic design of a vertebrate eye is identical in many respects to the basic design of a cephalopod eye. And yet we don't even know if their common ancestor had eyes. So I would say that in this case, convergent evolution could account for the fact that we have 2 eyes. But if you want to account for the fact that we have 2 eyes that have an almost identical basic design, now we're starting to strain the credulity that 2 organisms would just by chance independently evolve the same design. Would they by chance evolve the same fundamental design of their eyes? I think this is better explained by common design than convergent evolution. But let's move on here. What about 2 eyes in the human and the fly? Of course, nobody thinks that the common ancestor between humans or vertebrates, sorry guys, I think that there are some animation problems here. No one thinks that the common ancestor between vertebrates and arthropods had 2 eyes. So the fact that we have these similar 2 eyes is probably the result of convergent evolution. And I don't have a problem with that, but what's interesting is that when you look at the genetic basis for generating eyes in vertebrates, human beings, and arthropods, or the fly, we find that actually there is genetic similarity going on here. And so let me pull this up. So is this the result of common ancestry? No. The fact that humans and flies have 2 eyes is strictly a coincidence. Darwinians would call this convergent evolution. But the similarities go much deeper and are much more than meet the eye when it comes to the similarities between human beings and flies. And in fact, the same gene controls eye development in both human beings and flies. It's called PAX6. So here we might see what we might call, if this is in fact convergent evolution, it would be not just convergent morphological evolution to have 2 eyes, would be convergent genetic evolution at the genetic level to use the same gene to govern the generation of our eyes. So I would say, are we looking here at a convergent genetic evolution, sort of an extreme form of genetic convergent evolution, or common design? I would say that common design is a better explanation here. And there's a similar thing going on with regards to the growth of limbs. All these different types of animals, these various, we have vertebrates here, we have arthropods, echinoderms, we have various types of worms, and in each of these cases, they have limbs, but it's not even thought that the common ancestor had limbs. Okay, fine. Maybe we can say that there's common ancestry going on in terms of organisms evolving limbs. But it turns out that the same gene called distal less regulates limb growth in these basic animal types of organisms. And so I would say that this is, again, an example of convergent evolution at the genetic level, which is probably better explained by common design. And I apologize, I don't remember what these 2 worm phyla are, but I'll have to get back to you on that later. So extreme convergent evolution at the genetic level or common design? What is the better explanation? Sometimes even convergent morphological evolution really makes you scratch your head and wonder, okay, are we looking at common design or convergent evolution here? These are the skulls of the marsupial saber-toothed cat on the left-hand side and the placental saber-toothed cat on the right. And these two organisms are thought to have had a shrew-like ancestor that lived maybe, 50 to 60 million years ago, and they just by chance evolved a highly similar skull shape and skull structure. Of course, there are some differences, but you have to ask, is this the result of convergent evolution, or is this the result of some kind of common design? Okay, so convergent evolution, I would say, has its own problems. Richard Dawkins says that it is vanishingly improbable that exactly the same evolutionary pathway should ever be traveled twice. Yet he admits that there are, quote, numerous examples in which independent lines of evidence appear to have converged from very different starting points on what looks like a very same endpoint. And rather than admitting that convergent evolution provides a challenge to Darwinian claims, he says that it's simply, quote, all the more striking a testimony to the power of natural selection to produce the same designs in different organisms, provided that they're under the same selection pressures. But I would say that beyond the fact that convergent evolution is highly unlikely, it presents an even more difficult problem for Darwinian theory, and that it sort of challenges the basic methodology that we use for inferring common descent, where it shows that biological similarity does not necessarily imply common ancestry. And so this then takes our first assumption that similarity is the result of common ancestry, and it shows that it fails. And it kind of shows that that assumption is not necessarily true. And in fact, when you look, you can do statistical analyses of phylogenetic trees and ask to what extent is the data set distributed in a tree-like manner? Are these traits distributed in a tree-like manner? And when you do these statistical analyses, you can show that sometimes up to over 50% of the data might not be distributed in a tree-like pattern, and then you have to explain it either using common convergent evolution or loss of traits or other explanations. And so this assumption that that similarity reflects inheritance from a common ancestor fails all the time. And this is a real problem for the methodology used to invoke and infer common ancestry. So let's talk about also horizontal gene transfer. Horizontal gene transfer, we mentioned this earlier, but it's basically when you can inherit genes not just from a parent to an offspring, but also from your neighbor. You can actually get genes from a neighboring organism. And this is known to take place in bacteria, okay? So we know this does happen. It takes place in bacteria and certain other microorganisms, but it's not known to occur among higher organisms. And in fact, we don't directly observe it. In fact, usually when it's claimed to have occurred in higher organisms, we are inferring that because of phylogenetic conflict, not because we actually observe horizontal gene transfer going on and taking place in higher organisms. So this is another sort of ad hoc epicycle type explanation that's used to explain away data that does not fit a phylogenetic tree. And I would say that horizontal gene transfer is sort of like this. Let's say we have a store owner store manager who tells the owner that the cash register is infected with money-eating microorganisms. In fact, he insists the money missing from the cash register is proof that these bugs exist. Okay, so of course the owner is going to immediately get suspicious and say, okay, perhaps it's possible that the missing money from the cash register is simply from these cash-eating microorganisms, but I'm going to actually suspect that you did it, that the manager stole the money, and a responsible owner would not ignore other possible explanations. So what's going on here is that phylogenetic incongruity is not taken as evidence of problems with common descent. Okay, it's not taken as evidence that the manager stole the cash from the cash register. Rather, phylogenetic incongruity is taken as evidence of horizontal gene transfer. It's taken as evidence of these microscopic cash-eating microorganisms that nobody's ever seen. And so here's a quote from a scientific paper which makes this clear. It says, in the phylogenetic approach, each instance of a topological discordance, that would be a phylogenetic incongruity, each instance of a topological discordance between a gene tree and a trusted reference tree is taken as prima facie evidence of LGT, which is lateral gene transfer, which is another word for horizontal gene transfer. So now the fact that we see two conflicts between two trees, that is now evidence for the epicycle. It's not evidence that there's maybe a problem with the idea that organisms are related through common ancestry. It's evidence for the epicycle. It's or evidence for horizontal gene transfer. So we're not actually putting common descent on the table for testing. We're assuming it's true, and when we find evidence that conflicts with it, we go straight to the epicycle. That's the way evolutionary biology treats these issues. So, sorry for the, let me fix this typo here. Okay, so the basic problem is that biological similarities appear in places that are not predicted by common descent. And this indicates that it contradicts a nested hierarchy. However, if designers regularly reuse functional parts, programs, and components in different designs, could there be a better explanation for these conflicts between evolutionary trees? Maybe common design is a better explanation. And I would say that what we are left with as far as the assumptions of building trees is that the main assumption is more like functional similarity is the result of common ancestry, except for when it's not. Okay, functional similarity equals common ancestry, except for when it doesn't. And we see that these assumptions of phylogenetic tree building, they fail all the time. And this tree, so actually I'll tell a little story here. When Stephen Meyer wrote his book, Darwin's Doubt, I'm sure many of your viewers, Jeff, are familiar with Stephen Meyer. He's a very well-known ID theorist. When he wrote his book, Darwin's Doubt, in 2013, he made the case that the basic animal phyla, we've had trouble resolving them into a nice, clear phylogenetic set of relationships, okay? And immediately, evolutionary biologists disagreed, and one of them cited this particular tree from a paper looking at Cambrian arthropods, saying, look, we can organize arthropods into a tree. There's no problem here with common descent explaining the data. So then I dug into the tree and looked up sort of the fine print and the statistics that were used to analyze the degree to which the data that was used to build this tree actually fit the tree. And they found that when they built this tree, the main assumption of tree building failed 61.6% of the time. So in these cases, the main assumption of tree building, that similarity is the result of inheritance from common ancestor, the main assumption of tree building failed more often than it held true. So I think we have to ask, if an assumption is failing so much, even failing more often than it holds true, how can we justify making that assumption? And maybe it's time to question that assumption and ask whether it really is a good assumption to use as sort of the gold standard for building trees in biology and understanding evolutionary relationships. So what ID predicts is that yes, parts will be reused in different organisms, but there's no need or no requirement that we have to necessarily do this in a manner that matches a nested hierarchy. So we can reuse parts in different organisms, different designs, but we don't have to do it in a way that has to fit this sort of prediction of Darwin's theory that we should have this nested hierarchy. And in fact, one idea theorist named Winston Ewart, who's a computer programmer, came up with an idea called the dependency graph of way of organizing relationships between living organisms. It's essentially implementing the principle that computer programmers, when they will design programs, will pull and borrow program modules from different programs and then put them together to create the final program. But this borrowing of pieces and components from different other designs makes this system not necessarily result of vertical descent, but from common design, where we're using common design to build this computer program. And what he said is if we apply these principles to trying to understand the relationship between living organisms, that a dependency graph-based model explains the data far, far better than a common descent-based tree. And it was just orders of magnitude better at explaining the distribution of certain gene families across 13 diverse animal types, according to this preliminary analysis he did in this paper. So basically, a common design dependency graph is much, much better at explaining the distribution of traits among organisms than a common descent-based tree. So I would say that when we look at the various models for the tree of life, we have on the top here universal common ancestry, or the monophyletic view, where all organisms are related through a grand tree of life, or an orchard of trees, a polyphyletic view, where you might have different groups of organisms that were designed separately. And yes, there can be similarities across these organisms because of common design. I would say that the orchard view is a much better explanation for the data that we see, and that common descent is not explaining a lot of the data we see. Okay, well, that is my little talk here, Jeff, and I'm happy to chat for a bit. And let me see, how do I come back to Skype? And
I think you hit the share screen and stop it or something. There you go.
Stop sharing. There we go.
There you go.
All right.
Yeah. Okay. So getting back, that was a lot of information to take in. So the code changes. So that would be like you have as a computer programmer. So say it's like you have an instruction, a set of ones and zeros, right? And that gets interpreted and performs some sort of action in the circuitry or something like that. And then, or your operating system kind of does something with it. So what you're saying is, when you see a certain DNA, I'm just going to throw out letter. I know there's only a certain amount, but just say ABCD. ABCD will get translated to a certain protein or something like that. But the code problem is that, which would prevent there from be evidence against universal common descent, is that you have branches in this hypothetical tree that would translate ABCD as something different. So something that's like a very fun translating a DNA into something into a protein is very, very fundamental. So having a change is sounds like it would be highly disruptive to an organism.
Yeah, that's right. That gets back to the issue of the genetic code. And when we see these variants in the genetic code, what would the implications be for an organism? And you said that very well, Jeff. If we had ABCD in one organism, it would take that DNA sequence and interpret it to imply a certain output. But in a different organism, then we would interpret that ABCD and it would give us maybe a different protein sequence. And so how do you change the genetic code without radically also having to change the nucleotide sequence to match the new genetic code algorithm that's being used to interpret that DNA? If you don't have coordinated changes both in the DNA sequence and the logic of the genetic code, then you're going to end up with an organism that probably cannot properly interpret the genetic code to produce functional proteins. And that's a real problem.
It'd be like putting in a new type of it's not like if you went from like an Intel to an Intel microprocessor, it would be like going from an Intel to like an ARM or like a Apple microprocessor or a RISC chip or something, where it would just, you send the same ones and zeros, but it wouldn't give you the same results. I gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay, so about I'm thinking in terms of the horizontal gene transfer. How far up would they say horizontal gene transfer goes to try to solve this? Would they say it goes past bacteria into like multicellular organisms, or like how high up?
They definitely do say that. In fact, I've seen studies that have inferred horizontal gene transfer between humans and bacteria. Okay, so we're swapping genes with bacteria now. I don't know if anybody has identified the actual biological mechanism for doing that. They're simply inferring this horizontal gene transfer based upon the presence of genes that we know of from bacteria.
Would that be in like a sperm or an egg, or would they have to, like, how would you?
I don't know. I mean, maybe they would say that if I had to guess, I would say they probably would say that some virus infected bacteria and took that gene with it, and then that virus infected us, and the virus then put that gene into our genome. But I'm not sure if there's actual documented examples of this happening. The evidence that is cited, so you have to consider what is the evidence that's being cited for these out-of-place genes that don't really fit the standard phylogenetic tree. The evidence that's being cited is simply the fact that this gene doesn't fit the tree. And then from there, you just assume that horizontal gene transfer is sort of like this catch-all that can explain whatever you see that doesn't fit the tree, and they'll just invoke it at will to explain why we find this gene in the wrong place.
Okay, I guess that makes sense how they would argue that. Not that I would agree with that. So you have genes. If you follow different genes, you get conflicting trees. Has anyone tried to, I guess, well, it would be a very big computational problem, but so has anyone tried putting all these different conflicting trees based on various genes together? I mean, there's so many different genes, like, who knows how many genes there are, but that sounds like that would, you could visually, or even if you narrow it down, you could, I guess you could see, okay, if I follow this gene, I get this, I get this, I get this. So it seems like it's so widespread, you would get like an n factorial different amount of trees or something like that.
It is a real problem. Now, the idea is that, of course, genes can have their own histories, but there's only one branching order which reflects the true history of living organisms. Mm-hmm. And so the genes in your body should reflect the branching order of the human species. And in that case, we should be able to resolve our relationships to a dog or a mollusk or a fruit fly. The genes should tell similar stories in these different organisms. And maybe most of the time they will, but there will be cases where the genes don't tell the same evolutionary story. I think that people will actually sometimes take larger data sets. And the idea is that if we take enough data, then we can take lots of genes and use all of those genes to construct a tree. And I would say what ends up happening is you end up using so much data that you're not actually really testing this prediction anymore, that there should be a similarity of this evolutionary story across different traits. You're basically smoothing over the conflicts in order to ignore them, and you're using a methodology that can never find a conflict even if it was there. So if you're using these huge data sets, it does not necessarily actually allow you to test common ancestry. If common ancestry were true, then using these huge data sets might be the way to go. But you're not actually testing it at that point, because you're going to miss any potential conflicts when you use these huge data sets to build phylogenetic trees.
All right. So, but you were saying there was also conflicting trees based on other molecules within the body or something like that. That's
right. I mean, depending on what traits you use, whether we're talking about different genes, different biomolecules, genes versus physical traits of organisms, like, do they have hair? Do they have how many digits do they have on their limbs, etc. You can look at various traits, and whatever you choose to use, the problem of obtaining conflicting phylogenetic trees is found almost everywhere.
Okay. All right. No, I mean, that all makes sense. So the different molecules tell a different story. Genes tell different stories, and then molecules would tell different stories. And then I guess, there doesn't seem to be a way to kind of sort it out. That makes sense. I mean, even if they were saying was true about horizontal gene transfer or some sort, then you're right. That would make the theory unfalsifiable. Where you couldn't unscramble. You can't unscramble the egg, even if what they're saying is true. As implausible as what they're saying based on this evidence is. Yeah.
What you just said right there is exactly right, Jeff. I'm not saying that horizontal gene transfer never happens. I'm not saying that some of these conflicts are not better explained by horizontal gene transfer. Maybe they are in some cases. The problem is that when you always invoke epicycles to retain your theory of common descent every time you see data that conflicts with common ancestry, then you are treating common descent in an unfalsifiable manner. You're never putting it on the table for falsification, because you're saying every time I find data that does not fit with my theory, I'm going to go to the epicycle. I'm never going to actually test whether the theory itself is true. And so you are again, as you said, you are treating common ancestry in an unfalsifiable manner. And I don't think that's good for science. I think we should be able to put these theories on the table for testing, for falsification. And I think that common descent should be falsifiable. I think when you look at the data fairly, in my view, it's falsified by the data, at least universal common descent. Maybe it's true at smaller scale levels of the hierarchy of the tree of life. But I think at the macro, universal common ancestry, universal tree of life, it's definitely falsified. But the problem is evolutionary biologists don't want it to be falsified, so they start inventing these epicycles, and that allows them to treat it in an unfalsifiable manner, where no matter what data set you get, it'll be compatible with universal common ancestry.
Right. It's just a baked-in a priori assumption. I got that.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that was a lot of information. So I guess the only question I would have left is, beyond the horizontal gene transfer, has anyone tried to tackle this argument from a Darwinian perspective?
What do you mean by that exactly? Or?
Has anyone kind of, I guess I started seeing this in ID circles being pointed out maybe over a decade ago. Has anyone beyond, like, maybe, has anyone seriously taken up the challenge of this, or beyond the horizontal gene transfer kind of argument, or are they try to make a tree themselves or anything like that? Or maybe not even that, but like try to make a sustained argument to counter this evidence.
Yeah, I mean, people will try to justify what you end up seeing is people will try to justify their epicycles and their auxiliary hypotheses, saying, look, I know it's an auxiliary hypothesis, but this is why I think that's the right explanation. And so that is usually where the argument goes. I think, though, that some of the most innovative work is being done by Winston Ewart in that dependency graph model that I showed at the very end of my talk.
Right, yeah. That definitely makes sense as a software person.
Yeah, you would appreciate that probably more than a lot of us. I think that Winston's work gives us the potential to statistically compare models, to compare the common descent model versus a dependency graph model. And I know that Winston is still developing that work, and what he did originally was very preliminary, but I think over time he's hoping to be able to more robustly test the dependency graph model versus the tree of life common ancestry model. And maybe in time we'll be able to also test the viability of auxiliary hypotheses as well, the horizontal gene transfer, the convergent evolution. I think that convergent evolution is one that is potentially fairly testable, because what we're saying is that these two features evolved independently. Well, then we can start to say, okay, well, what is the likelihood of this feature evolving, even one time? And then, you can do the waiting times kind of analysis where you say,
yeah. Oh, sorry to interrupt you, but it seems the problem would be that you would have to find the same proteins in the same genes. You have a search space. You have to natural selection and random mutation has to find. And even though that's very remote mathematically, you seem like you wouldn't have enough time, because especially when it's one thing if you're doing that with bacteria. It's another thing if you're doing that with mammals or whatever, where when bacteria, if it doubles every 15 minutes or something, that's one thing. But if you have a mammal that has a gestation period of a week or more, it seems like you wouldn't have enough time to do the convergent evolution with all the different examples. That's just off the top of my head. Not that I can have the information to do the math myself, but. Does that make sense?
These are tractable questions. You're right, Jeff. And I think that these are the kinds of questions we can start to ask as to what is the likelihood of this evolving, given the amount of time, the replication or reproduction rate, the genome size, the number of organisms in the population, all that. These are tractable questions we can start to look at. Yeah.
One thing as a computer science person that I try to think as is that. When you're writing code, your code is blind, right? So it does stuff because you did stuff. But when you're searching on stuff, right? It's not like, a human can just be like, I see this PS4 remote and just grab it. It's just intuitive. It just happens, and I'm not entirely sure how it happens. But for a computer, you would have to do a search. You have to think in terms, when you're writing code, you have to think in terms of blindness. It's dumb. That the computers are dumb. If that makes sense. And so in the same way, like when you're searching out for convergent evolution, to get these matches in these different trees or something, then if it's the same tree, then I don't know. I guess on the fly it's hard for me to describe it, but it would just be the algorithm to find the same solution multiple times.
Yeah.
When it's blind, it's one thing if you say, "Hey, go do this," and go find this, and you give it some parameters and all. But when you don't give anything any parameters, for it to find the same thing just based off of random chance and natural selection pressures seems mathematically absurd.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. Of course, an evolutionary scientist will reply that natural selection is not random. And when you have certain selection pressures, you can push organisms into similar directions. And that's certainly the response that you get. And that may be true to an extent, but we can ask, okay, how similar are these things? What is the likelihood of getting these high degrees of similarities? I think that these are interesting questions. There have been some papers actually that have asked, what is the likelihood of getting the same genes just by blind chance? And of course, they find that it's statistically ridiculous that you would never get these same genes evolving just by chance. And so they conclude, that means the common ancestry is clearly the right explanation. There was a paper published in Nature like this a few years ago. And there was a response from some evolutionary biologists who said, that paper was an exercise in triviality. To say that the likelihood of generating these things randomly, blindly, is totally unlikely, and therefore it must be common ancestry. I mean, this is a trivial exercise. Of course, that's true. And what I would say is that evolutionary biologists are ignoring the possibility that another explanation. It's not just your options are not just common ancestry or blind randomness. There's also the option of common design. When you bring intelligent agency into the picture, intelligent agents can find very unlikely solutions to problems, and they can do this independently in different designs. So I think that intelligent design is capable of explaining the fact that we see these same designs appearing over and over again in different organisms. Convergent evolution is so common. Simon Conway Morris, who is an evolutionary biologist at Oxford, he's not supportive of intelligent design, but if you read his books, he says over and over again that convergence is ubiquitous throughout life. The word he uses is ubiquitous. That's what he says about finding the same designs convergently evolved in living organisms. I think that tells us something about common design rather than sort of these unguided mechanisms.
Right. That's also why I mentioned the limitations on how many generations you have, especially once you get past unicellular life.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, well, I guess that's all I had, unless you had something else to share.
No, it's been fun, and I appreciate the opportunity, Jeff.
All right, maybe I don't know what for or when, but maybe we should have you on again in the future. This has been like in the back of my mind for over a decade. So I'm glad to have you on, and we'll get your compatriot on hopefully in a few weeks and stuff like that.
Sounds good. Well, thanks so much, and I appreciate time to present.
All right, thank you.
All right, take care.